We're continuing our series this morning on the purpose-driven family, and I want us to look at an event from the life of Daniel, which is Daniel the Lion's Den. And here I want us to observe some character traits of Daniel that really we need to be developing in our children and also for those in our own personal life and also in the lives of those around us, because it's only then that we really will begin to see kingdom impact in our world. And so as we look at these three character traits, you will see that they are vital if we're going to produce children who have a kingdom impact, who are focused on the kingdom and doing great things for God. I don't know about you. Hopefully, none of us would say that, our goal in life is just to be sort of, or to raise children that are sort of, right? I mean, hopefully that's none of our, or let's even take a little step further. We don't want to see our grandchildren grow up just to be average, mediocre, right? We want to see our children, we want to see our grandchildren, we want to see in our own personal life that we are living lives that are having impact on the world around us. And that's exactly what we see in Daniel. We're going to look at the whole chapter this morning, Daniel chapter 6. And I don't normally read the whole chapter, but we're going to read these 28 verses, or I'm going to read them, and I want you to follow along with me as we look at them together. I'm using the New Living Translation this morning. It's normally not a translation I use to preach with. I normally would use probably the Christian Standard Bible. But it's a narrative, and it just reads well, and it sort of fills in some of the gaps of the story. And so we're going to be looking at the New Living Translation this morning, and I will use it throughout. I've sort of said before, I don't like cherry picking. I don't like, I've got a Bible program on my computer, and I don't know how many Bible versions that I have. And I don't like doing like a word search and picking which translation it says what I want it to say. And so whatever translation I'm going to use, I usually try to use throughout, unless I'm going to illustrate with something, and I may do that. And so that's just sort of me. Again, looking at Daniel chapter 6, verse 1 through verse 28. It begins in verse 1. It says, Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. The king also chose Daniel and two others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interest. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. Then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. So they concluded, our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. So the administrators and high officers went to the king and said, Long live King Darius. That's always sort of a warning sign, right? In verse 7, we are all in agreement. Another sort of overstatement, right? I mean, did he really contact all 120 of these underlings? Probably not. But, when you're trying to make your point, it's sort of like when a church member comes complaining about something, they never say, Joe and I were talking, and they say what? Man, there's been a bunch of folks. I mean, there's a lot of folks that are upset about whatever. Thankfully, that's not really a problem I have here, but I have other places. And probably even in your work, it's probably the same thing. Probably, if you're a coach, you probably wouldn't have one kid that would come and say, Coach, I don't like doing the 120-yard sprints after practice, right? That really wouldn't work very well. Do you think? So any of you that's played sports, you think that would work very well? Y'all looking at me sort of strange. I know in my school it wouldn't have worked. I mean, you not only would run the 120 sprints, but then you'd have been doing the circuits after that. You'd have been running stadiums. So another issue. We're all in agreement, we administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. And now, your majesty, issue and sign this law so it cannot be changed, an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. So King Darius signed the law. But when Daniel learned the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room, with its windows open toward Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. Then the officials went together to Daniel's house and found him praying and asking for God's help. So they went straight to the king and reminded him about his law. Did you not sign a law that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions? Yes, the king replied, that decision stands. It is an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. Then they told the king, that man, Daniel, one of the captives from Judah, is ignoring you and your law. He still prays to his God 3 times a day. Hearing this, the king was deeply troubled, and he tried to think of a way to save Daniel. He spent the rest of the day looking for a way to get Daniel out of his predicament. Verse 15. In the evening, the men went together to the king and said, Your Majesty, you know that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no law that the king signs can be changed. So at last the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the den of lions. And the king said to him, May your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed the stone with his royal seal and the seals of his nobles, so that no one could rescue Daniel. And the king returned to his palace and spent the night fasting. He refused his usual entertainment and couldn't sleep at all that night. Very early the next morning, the king got up and hurried out to the lion's den. When he got there, he called out in anguish, Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God whom you serve so faithfully able to rescue you from the lions? And Daniel answered, Long live the king. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me. For I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and ordered that Daniel be lifted from the den. Not a scratch was found out on him, for he had trusted in his God. Then the king gave orders to arrest the men who had maliciously accused Daniel. He had them thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. The lions leaped on them and tore them apart before they even hit the floor of the den. Just want to pause here just for a moment and chase one little short rabbit. He's short and a slow rabbit. There's some who want to look at this story and they say, well, the reason why the lions didn't eat Daniel wasn't because Daniel's God delivered him. It's because the lions really weren't very hungry. Well, this sort of blows that up, right? The lions leaped up on them and tore them apart before they even hit the floor of the den. And then King Darius sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. Peace and prosperity to you. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. As we look this morning at these 3 key character traits that we want to develop in our children, I really want to encourage you that, I don't know about you, but as we look through the stories, we'll look at these traits, these character traits. They're really character traits that all of us should be looking to apply in our own life and allowing God to transform us from the inside out so that these same things can be said about us. And one of the things and this really isn't a main point of the sermon, but one of the things about this story of Daniel is Daniel was going to serve God whether God chose to deliver him from the lions or not. That even if God would allow the lions to eat him, Daniel was going to be faithful until the end. He knew there was a severe consequence when he chose to disobey the commands of the king, and yet he was willing to obey even if it cost him his life. And so I want to jump into these 3 key character traits, and then I want us to look at the result of what happens as we allow these character traits to flow out of our lives. And really, as we'll see, it's as we begin to allow these character traits to flow through us, it's then we begin to develop them in our children. Because do as I say, not as I do never works, right? This means yes, this means no, and this means I'm not real sure. If you have children, you know that rule doesn't work, right? My daddy used to do that every now and then. He'd mess up and I'd catch him as a kid. Really, I didn't really call it out because that would have been I wouldn't have been fed to the lions, but I would have been filleted alive or something, I don't know. But he used to say something, do as I say, that don't really work very well. Because we end up doing is we do what they do, right? And our kids do what we do. And so we think about these three character traits. The first one is we need to be trustworthy. To be trustworthy is to be able to be relied upon as being honest and being truthful. And this is exactly what we see in the life of Daniel. If we go back to Daniel chapter 1, whenever Daniel had been brought in by Nebuchadnezzar and he had been produced all these choice foods and he said, I can't eat those foods. You remember the story? Daniel would have been in his early teens. At this point in the story in Daniel chapter 6, Daniel was in his 80s. And so this isn't like just a little flash in the pan, but you look at a man that for 80 years his life has been observed and he has been living out what it means to be trustworthy day in and day out. Now, we know that he's a man, and so there were times that he probably failed. We know that he did fail, just like all of us fail. But for the most part, his life was one that had been lived out as being trustworthy and faithful. And we see this characteristic being lived out through his life as King Darius divides the kingdom into 120 provinces. He places an officer over each of the provinces, and then he places 3 administrators over the 120 officers. And then as he begins to look at the best of the best, he looks at Daniel and says, man, when I look at his life, I see a man whose word is his word and a man who lives out a trustworthy life. This guy I can trust to put over my kingdom. What happens if you put someone who's not faithful over your stuff? You don't have it for very long, right? It goes to them or somebody else. And what he saw is he looked at his kingdom, he looked at all the different people, and he said, this is the guy that's going to be my right-hand man as I hold up my left hand. He's going to be my right-hand man. He's going to be there right beside me, making the decisions for me, that when Daniel speaks, it will be as though I myself were speaking. And when the word gets out to the others about Daniel being advanced up as the top of the top, the other administrators are filled with jealousy, and they immediately begin to plot Daniel's downfall. Look at what the Bible says as we look back in verse 4. Then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. Man, that's unusual, isn't it? They must have not been Baptists. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. And so as they began to examine Daniel's life, they discovered that Daniel was faithful. Look at what the words they use here in the New Living Translation, that he was always responsible. And what that's speaking to is when it came to his work, he always did above and beyond. He always did his work to the very best that he could do it. He was always responsible in his work. But also it says that he was completely trustworthy. There was nothing lacking in his character. If he said there was $100 in the account, there was $100 in the account. That he was always trustworthy in his character. You could always trust him with how he lived his life. And what we as parents and grandparents and adults need to teach our children is the importance of putting in an honest day's work. One of the lessons, I give my dad a hard time, one, because he's not here. But it's like my daughter, I give her a hard time when she's not here as well. But one of the things my dad taught me, that he taught me well, was to do an honest day's work for what you're going to get paid. When I was in high school, my dad contracted with my cousin and I to paint the trim of his house. He had a brick house, but we were to paint the trim. Well, my cousin never showed up, and so I painted the whole outside of the house myself. When my daddy got ready to pay us, he paid my cousin the same amount that he paid me. I was furious. And my dad said, my agreement was with both of you. The fact that he didn't show up, that's between you and him. And what my dad was teaching me that day was I had made an agreement to paint the house. And I fulfilled my responsibility. And whether he wanted to pay my cousin or not really didn't really matter. It was my responsibility to do what I had called myself to do, what I had agreed to do. And how we teach our children about an honest day's work is, first of all, in our own personal life, that we are to live out that importance, that we are to be workers, that we are to do our very best. Now, we ought to work hard and we ought to sometimes play hard, right? I mean, if all you do is work and you never laugh and have a good time, that's a boring life, right? And life is too short for that. but also by the standards that we hold them accountable to, that we ought to set standards. We ought to set a bar for our children, and we should encourage them to reach that bar, and that we ought to hold them accountable, right? That when they fall short, that we encourage them. Is it, did I not coach them up? Did I not teach them the things they need to know to be able to do it? Did I provide the resources? Did they not meet the goal just because they chose not to? And then we need to make decisions on how we deal with our children in that matter, that we hold them accountable. But as we continue on, look at what else they say about Daniel's trustworthiness, his character. In verse 5, it says, "So they concluded, our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel being in connection with the rules of his religion." And so as they examined Daniel's life, they couldn't find anything wrong until it came to his walk with God. And they knew that if it came between choosing between obeying his God or obeying the government, Daniel would do what? He was going to obey God. They said, this is the thing that we can catch him in. Because they knew that Daniel's relationship with God would never allow him to worship any other God. And so two things that we know about Daniel's faith in the story is one that he was not a secret disciple. Everyone knew that he walked with God. Now, I don't think that Daniel walked around saying, "I am the self-righteous, holy man of God." I don't think that's what he did at all. It sort of reminds me of that Ray Stevens song where the squirrel got loose in that self-righteous church. Some of you a little older may remember the story. If not, I encourage you to YouTube and watch it because it's a good, or watch the singing of it. It's a good little song. That it wasn't about being self-righteous. He just lived the life. He was consistent. He obeyed the commands of God. He lived for God. He was fair in his treatment with others, whether you were an up or you were a nobody. Daniel was consistent. He lived out what it meant to be a follower of the living God. And also, they realized that, and we see in the stories, that Daniel would rather die than compromise his walk with God, that he was serious about his walk with God. And I would encourage you as parents that we need to have that same commitment in our walk with God, that our children and those around us know that we are not secret disciples, but that we are followers of God, and that how we conduct ourselves displays that walk with God. And what Daniel did is Daniel took the commands of God seriously. Look at if we go back to God's command through Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 6, what God said was, "Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone." I want to say it in another translation. The New Living Translation threw me off a little bit. "Listen, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. And you must commit yourself wholeheartedly to these commands that I am giving you today." And what we see in the life of Daniel is that Daniel lived out what this verse says. That it wasn't just about affirming it with his words, he affirmed it with his life, that he loved the Lord his God with all of his heart, with all of his soul, and with all of his strength, that he was wholehearted in his following after God. And if we're going to pass this on to our children, then we need to take this command seriously, that we need to live it out. But also look at what it says in verse 7 of Deuteronomy chapter 6. It says, "Repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you are on the road, when you're going to bed and when you are getting up." And what God is commanding through Moses is that his people are to so live the commands of God that when they're walking through life, they're taking those teachable moments to instruct their children. I think I've told this story before, but Missouri was probably, 3 or 4 years old, and I don't know how many funerals she had been through in her life, because I was pastoring an older church, and there were some weeks that I would do 5 or 6 funerals in a week. And so she was used to going to funeral homes, but all of a sudden, she got in her head that she's going to go crazy. She was like behind the casket, climbing on the casket, knocking the flowers over. And I'm like, what? Something come in and possessed my child. What is going on? And so it was a funeral home that I had never been in. I think I may have told this story before. And so I wasn't really sure where the bathroom was because I didn't really want to beat her in front of everybody. And so I get her by the hand and I'm walking her to the bathroom. I'm trying to find out where it is. And I asked the guy, one of the funeral home guys, said, "Hey, where's your restroom?" And about that time she looked up at him and she said, "Please don't let him kill me." And how do you whoop a child after that? And so I took her to the restroom and I said, "I should tear your little tail up. I ought to whoop you right now, but I'm going to show grace to you. You deserve a whooping, but I'm going to show my favor and I'm going to let you pass." Sort of a silly story, but that's sort of what it means. Whenever we blow it and we say something we shouldn't say in front of our children, or we make a decision, that we should own up to it before them. If we mess up, tell them that we messed up. I don't know how many of you have been following along with the Southern Baptist Convention and all this. It's the same mess that's been going on with the cover-up of sexual assault in the life of the churches and stuff. And I read this week that a girl said, when she was a teenager, she was sexually assaulted in a church, and she said the pastor covered it up. And she said, here we are 30 years later, and he still refuses to admit anything. And I'm saying, why? If you messed up, just say you messed up. Isn't that right? Am I some stranger? From another planet or something? I don't know. But just own up to it. You think your kids don't realize you mess up? All they have to do is wait till they ride home from church when you get mad, when that person cuts you off and you blow the horn at them, and you tell them they're number one. Hopefully you don't do that. But own up to it. Be real before our children. Let them see what forgiveness is about and what grace is about. Let them see what it means to spend time in God's Word and to pray. Allow your kids to see you living the life. When they get up in the morning and when they lay down at night, let them see it throughout the day. They need to understand, what does it mean to be a follower of Christ? And the only way they can do that is if they see it being lived out in our lives. And so we need to teach our children to be trustworthy. We also need to teach them to be resilient. To be resilient is the ability to withstand or recover from difficult circumstances. It's also defined as the ability to spring back into shape after being bent and stretched by the circumstances of life. In Daniel chapter 6, we see Daniel really in a very difficult situation, right? The circumstances of his life are perilous. Think about this. He's gone from the top of the top. The only person higher than him in the kingdom is the king himself. And now he finds himself about to be thrown into the lion's den. That's a pretty big change of circumstances, right? 1 minute he's up for a promotion, the next minute not only is he getting fired, but he's going to be killed. He's in a dire situation. And it'd be easy for Daniel to cave under the weight of the circumstance of his life. But instead, Daniel turned to his God for strength. He did. Instead of buying in and falling, sort of go back and look at the story a little bit. These jealous guys come and appeal to the pride of the king. The king sets this dumb rule about, you can't pray to anybody but me for the next 30 days. And then it comes back and Daniel's the one that prays. And he's going to have to throw a man that he loves and respects into the lion's den to be eaten because he can't revoke the law. But how does Daniel respond? Look with me at verse 10. It says, when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room. Now what we have here is on the roof of the home, they oftentimes would have another little room upstairs that was open where people could see, because you'd want air to flow through because it'd be hot up there, and so you want air to flow through. And so Daniel is upstairs in the room that he always goes and prays in. He says, with its window open toward Jerusalem, and he prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. Why do you think he would face toward Jerusalem? We're back in the Old Testament. Why would he face toward Jerusalem? What's in Jerusalem, or what was in Jerusalem? The temple, right? And what does the temple represent? The presence of God, right? The God's Shekinah glory came upon the temple, and so as he's bowing toward Jerusalem, he's symbolically bowing before the very presence of God himself. And 3 times a day he prays, just as he had always done, giving thanks to God. And then in verse 11 we're told that he asked God for his help. So the law's passed. Daniel does what he always does. Being a man of courage and conviction, he goes up to his roof and he prays, knowing that this act would have severe and deadly consequences. So how do we reconcile Daniel's disobedience to the government when the Bible teaches that we are to obey the government? We see that in the book of Romans. Well, the Bible teaches that there is a higher law, and that is God's law. When the laws of man are in conflict with the laws of God, then we are to obey God and his laws. And listen, men and women, we are living in a day where being a Christian is more and more difficult. We are not facing the persecution that we're seeing in other countries. If we have any persecution at all, we may not get a job, or we may be sued by somebody, or there may be some goofy law passed in some state. Thankfully, Texas isn't there yet. But But it's getting more and more difficult to live out our Christian faith. And the Bible says that we shouldn't be surprised by this, that the Bible actually says that as the day of our Lord's return comes, the world will become more and more sinful. As a matter of fact, if we go back and look through church history, we can see this cycle going on and on and on, where God brings about this great revival. The people begin to drift away from God. They eventually sort of turn their back on God, and they begin to turn back to the sinful things of this world. Judgment usually comes, and they return back to God. But eventually there's going to be an eternal judgment that will come, and God will gather His people, and He will judge the earth and those who have rebelled against Him. But until that day comes, we must take strong stands. And that doesn't mean that we have to be rude. It doesn't mean that we need to be defending God or anybody else. I don't know about you, but when I see the world attacking the church, my natural instinct is I want to defend the church, because the church is the bride of Christ. But you know, the reality is God doesn't need us to defend His church. He's the groom. He will defend His church, right? He will defend the church. What we need to do is we need to live out our faith, and we need to love those who are even caught up in a sinful lifestyle. It doesn't mean we have to excuse it. The scary thing is that oftentimes we hold the world to a strict standard and we ourselves live by a loose standard. Oh, I live under grace, so I can sort of do what I want to do. And then so like a friend of mine that would go out and party on Saturday night, and then at midnight he'd go to Mass and confess his sins. We sort of laugh about it, but we Baptists do the same thing. We just don't have to go to Mass. We don't have to wait till midnight or Sunday morning. We can just go and pray and ask God to forgive. We just keep living however we want to live. And what we tend to do is we don't live out what we say we believe, and yet we expect the lost world to live out what it should do. The reality is the world is going to live like the world, and we, the people of God, need to live out what people of God ought to live like. And that's what we need to look like Jesus. We don't see Jesus going into the den of the tax collectors and dumping tables over, do we? No, He goes to Matthew and says, "Come and follow me, and I will not make you a fisher of men." He told that to the fishermen, but said, "Come and follow after me." And Matthew came and followed after Him, right? What does He turn the table over at? In the temple, in the place where the religious folks are at. What we need to live out what we say we believe. Even when the hardships and the struggles of life come, and the circumstances of life turn upside down, and our world is shaken to the very core, and God puts more on us than we can handle. Sort of opposite what's being said a lot today, right? God won't put Him more. I read that with a friend of mine this week, and I almost want to twist off. God won't put Him more on me than what I can handle. Bull baloney, right? That's not true. God puts us under more than we can handle all the time, because then He shows up and gives us the strength to endure what we could never endure on our own. Right? And that's what we see here with Daniel. Daniel goes and he begins to thank God, and he prays that God would help him through this circumstance, even if it meant dying for his faith. And we need to teach our children the same thing. We need to teach our children that sometimes taking the right stand may cost them dearly. It may cost them some friends. It may cost them a job at some point. It may even cost them their life. And we don't need to buy into this mindset that we only do missions where it's safe. Do you realize that we have missionaries right now that are serving all over the Muslim world? Now, they're not there as missionaries. They're there as businessmen or women. They're over there as teachers. They're over there teaching English in China and all over different parts of the world. In some of the places they serve, if they were to be caught, they would be killed for their faith or imprisoned. God doesn't call us to take the safe route. And doing the right thing oftentimes is very difficult. But listen, we have this promise. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 8 through verse 9, it says, "We are pressed on every side by troubles, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed." Why is that? Because we are never abandoned by God. And Daniel understood as he bowed toward Jerusalem and prayed to God, he believed that God would be with him even in the lion's den. And if we're going to bring up kids who are having an impact for the kingdom of God, then we need to teach them to be trustworthy, to be resilient, and then finally to be consistent. To be resilient and to be consistent almost seems like the same thing, but it really is not. To be resilient really is to continue on even under difficulty. To be consistent is that idea of being unchanging in nature, standard, or effect over time. In other words, that we're the same. When things are going good, we're this way. When things are going bad, we're still the same person. We don't flip and flop depending upon who we are. We don't go in and change mask like we're in a theater trying to determine who we are at this particular moment. But we are to be the same all the time. We're not to be chameleons. We don't change based upon the hotness of the situation that we find ourselves in. Listen, when the command came down to not pray to anyone except for the king for 30 days, Daniel continued on as he had always done. He bowed and prayed to God 3 times a day. His enemies see him praying, they go to the king, bring charge against Daniel. The Bible says the king was deeply troubled and tried to come up with another plan. Matter of fact, all night long he stayed up. He didn't even go and do the normal fun things he normally do. Instead, he sat there fasting and praying, trying to figure out some way that he can deliver Daniel. But unable to find a way, he finally has Daniel arrested and thrown into a lion's den. But before he throws him into the lion's den, or has him thrown in the lion's den, he says these words in verse 16, "May your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you." This God that you serve constantly, may He rescue you. You know, the king was unsure if God would deliver Daniel or not, but he prayed that God would deliver Daniel because he understood that it was out of his hands. There was nothing he could do to save Daniel. Only God could save Daniel. And God majors on the impossible. The one thing that really stands out in this verse is that Daniel had lived such a powerful example before Darius that Darius knew that Daniel walked with God. And he believed that Daniel's God could deliver Daniel. Listen, if we're going to bring up children who are consistent in their service to God and others, then we must live a consistent life before them. They need to see us live a life that is fully committed to serving God, that we serve Him with all of our heart, all our soul, and all of our mind, that we love Him with all that we are, and we serve Him continually. And this doesn't mean that we're to live a perfect life. Not one of us is perfect. None of us. And if you think you're perfect, just wait. God's going to quickly allow some things to happen to show you that you're not so perfect. Matter of fact, God won't even have to do it. You'll do it to yourself. It doesn't mean that we're perfect, but it does mean that we show forgiveness and grace, and we also ask for it when we mess up ourselves, that we own up to our sin. We own up to our failures. What is the result of a life that is trustworthy, resilient, and consistent? The result is that God is exalted. The word exalt comes from a Hebrew word that means to lift up. We exalt God by lifting Him high with our words of praise and adoration, and also with our life of praise and adoration. As Daniel lived out his faith before Darius, the result was that Darius saw God high and exalted. Look at Darius's response in verse 26 and verse 27. He said, "I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear or reverence before the God of Daniel, for He is the living God, and He will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and His rule will never end. He rescues and saves His people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth, and He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." Man, you're talking about words of exaltation, talking about praising and worshiping the one true God. Let's go back quickly and look at the words. He says that He is the living God. In reference to what? All the dead gods that they had worshipped forever and ever, that He is the one who is the living God, and that this God will endure forever, that He is eternal. His kingdom will never be destroyed, that He is the King of all kings, that bows to no other king, that all kingdoms will bow before Him. His rule will never end. His sovereignty is eternal. He rescues and saves His people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. And then he gets personal. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. Man, he goes from the way out there God who's living and powerful and sovereign to the God who rescued and saved my friend. Man, Daniel had lived a godly life before others, even the king, and it led to God's name being exalted before the whole nation. As parents, it is vital that, and grandparents, as church people, as believers, as followers of Jesus Christ, it's important that we live out a godly life before our children, before our spouses, before our co-workers. And the result is that God's name will be exalted in the lives of our children, our spouses, our co-workers, and then their lives will lead others to exalt God as well. As we look and pause to examine our own lives and the life that we're living before our children and others, the question for each of us this morning is this: if our lives were held to the same standard as Daniel's, if someone were to write about your life, someone who's there that's watching you all the time were to sit and write about your life, how would they find you? Would they find you as being trustworthy? Could they trust you that you're going to do what you say you're going to do? Are you resilient that when hard times come, you don't just quit? Instead, you say, God, with your strength, I'm going to keep going. Even if I'm on my belly crawling, I can't even pick my head up. With your strength, I'm going to keep moving. I'm going to be resilient. I'm not going to give up. And then finally, would they say that your life is consistent? Or are you the same regardless of the crowd that you're in front of? If you're in front of coworkers and they're telling a dirty joke, does your life change? If you're in front of the muckety mucks, the uppity ups of Lufkin, do you change? I mean, does your words, does your actions, does your life change based upon who you're in front of or the circumstances of your life? Are you consistent? Are you trustworthy? Are you resilient? Are you consistent? That's a question that all of us have to answer in our lives, because that's the key. And the reality is that really all of us are going to fall short at different times in all three of those areas, right? I mean, especially when our kids are watching us. Man, you think you all alone? Oh man, they got little eyes. They're everywhere watching. They see everything we do. And there's times that we find ourselves not being trustworthy. There's times that we're not resilient. There's times that we want to quit and we just want to sit down on the sidelines and just stop. There's sometimes we're not very consistent. Man, I'm going to start having a quiet time with God in the mornings or at night, whatever your time is. And then 3 days later, we still hadn't done it. We're not consistent. God is wanting to move and work in our lives so that His name can be exalted. That's who we are as a church. That's who we are as followers of Christ, that we are to know Him and we are to make Him known. But how we make Him known is we exalt Him both with our words and with our actions, how we live our lives. We're not going to have a come-down invitation this morning, but I wanted to spend a few moments in prayer. I want to pray for you, and if you need someone to talk to, I want to encourage you to be sure and come and talk to me, or Dawn's here. We've got a lot of our deacons here, other people who are leaders in our church that will be willing to discuss and talk with you about your walk with Christ, to pray with you. If you need somebody to help you stay accountable, to help you walk with that, let's pray together.